And so I grew up as a kid in the 90s in church, and this was a phenomenon that hit the What Would Jesus Do? It hit all the youth groups. Like every youth group had these bracelets out and about. And it really actually, the bracelet, this idea started in a youth group in Michigan, just a small youth group, about 30 or 40 kids. And then all of a sudden they went to like a camper conference and all the other youth groups wanted to do it. And then all of a sudden, because it's not trademarked, it's just a phrase. And all of a sudden, all these Christian bookstores started printing these bracelets, and they were on everyone, and not just even Christians. They were on celebrities. Like there was, I saw that there was some celebrities like Kurt Cobain. You know, like he was seen in concerts wearing these. I mean, it went way beyond just the church youth group thing. It became like a trend. It almost was like a old school meme, right? Like it's this thing that everyone started sharing, even if they didn't know what it meant. We just shared it and we participated in it. But for youth groups and stuff, like when I grew up in, it was a big deal. There's a song, What Would Jesus Do? By Big Tent Revival. There was sermons, and I remember our youth pastor posed that question, like, what would Jesus do in this situation? But it goes actually further back than that. Charles Spurgeon actually preached the message. If you're Charles Spurgeon fans, he preached the message called What Would Jesus Do? And that's kind of where the youth group grabbed that. But Charles Spurgeon kind of grabbed the idea from an old theologian named Thomas Kempis, who wrote a book called The Imitation of Christ. And the whole idea was, what does Jesus do in different situations? Practical. And so this is something that goes actually beyond the 90s. But it's a question, I think, that should be on the forefront of our minds as Christians, as believers. Even if we're no longer in the 90s, even if we no longer wear it on our wrist. But I do think it's helpful. In fact, we have these little bracelets that we give out 2 times a year when we do 21 days of prayer. It just says pray first on it. It just kind of serves as a reminder. When you're wearing something, it's like, hey, this is my first response, not my last resort. It just serves as a reminder when you're driving down the road and someone cuts you off, and before you lift a hand or fingers or whatever you do, you see that on your wrist and you just clench the steering wheel a little tighter, right? And so it serves as a great reminder, but I think there's something deeper than just a reminder. I think there's something more than just that, and that's what we're going to kind of take a look at in this next series. But I love the 90s. The 90s were my era. It was when I was in middle school and high school. I love the cargo pants and the Doc Martens. I love the plaid shirts. This is a sad reality, but a lot of the music I used to listen to in high school, like that was on the radio, Green Day, Alanis Morissette, Creed. Man, I was a big Creed fan, and stuff like that. This is what's sad, as I was listening to the radio the other day, and my son was flipping through the channels, and it said, listen to all your classic hits from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's like, what? No, that's modern radio, right? No, not anymore. Now it's considered classics. But 90s Christian had its own vibe. Like there was the 90s world, but then there was the 90s Christian, and really like trends started taking off in churches, and everyone before that was pretty kind of did the same thing, but all of a sudden there was these little factions of different groups of people who sang different songs, and I don't know, maybe some of you, like the best band ever of all times, DC Talk. DC Talk, one of my favorite bands. If you watched any Christian cartoons, VeggieTales started in the 90s. There was the greatest cinematic production of all times, and this will tell you if you're really churchy right here, okay? The Buttercream Gang. Anyone grew up in a little Christian bubble like me, and you watch the Buttercream, it's just, you got to watch the movie. It's on YouTube. You can watch it for free. It's the best movie ever made it won no awards, but it should have. But it was this all of a sudden Christians started producing movies and music and all these little things. There was even Christian superheroes. I don't know if you know this. You can look it up in the 90s. But there, Marvel had Iron Man and Spider-Man, DC, Batman, Superman. But in the church, we had Bible Man. And he fought with the sword of the Spirit. It was a Bible that turned into a sword. It was kind of cool. And so we had all these different things, and I loved it. It was such a great era for me. I grew up in it. I got saved in that era. And it was a great time. And if you knew any of those last references, this is what it should tell you. One is you grew up in a Christian bubble, maybe like me, and also that you're older than what you think you are. And so if you didn't get these, go back. You can Google them. It's all on YouTube. But I found myself making this statement the other day, thinking about the 90s and like my era. And I made this statement, maybe you've said this before. They just don't make blank. It doesn't even matter what like they used to. Have you ever said that? They just don't make music like they used to. They don't make movies like they used to. It's just not the same. And what I figured out is that the second that you say that out loud, that is a dating process. And the second that thought turns into words and comes out your mouth, this is one thing you know, I'm old. And so I've been saying that. My kids were like showing me some new Christian rap, and I couldn't like hang with it. I was like, I remember DC Talk when they rapped, God is doing a new thing. Love is a Verb, like I knew those raps, and they're like, Dad, that sounds like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. and like once you start saying and having those feelings and those sentiments, you realize like there's another generation or two behind you. Like there's an era at which you think is the best, but now once you start saying things like it's just not like it used to be, we start to realize man, there's generations behind me. And I think this idea of what would Jesus do, yes, it started in the 90s, but I think it's something that every generation should be asking. I think it's something that our youth, whether they wear the bracelets or not, which my kids think it's cool, whether they wear the bracelets or not, this is a pertinent question for us. Like as believers and followers of Christ, no matter what era you grew up in, no matter whether you grew up listening to the Gaithers or to DC Talk, or maybe you listen to KB or Andy Mineo now, it doesn't matter. I think this is a pertinent question for us. And so we're going to dive into it, but this bracelet really kind of summarized in one verse here. This is 1 John 2:6. Says this, anyone who says he is a Christian should live as Christ did. This is really the whole thought of what would Jesus do, kind of is summarized into this one verse. Anyone who says they're a Christian, anyone who claims to be a Christian, we should live as Christ lived. What would Jesus do is it's an easy statement to lay over lots of easy conversations. And I think this is where most of the time it gets used. We'd say, what would Jesus do in this situation? What would Jesus do if he were here? What would Jesus say if he was having this conversation? How would Jesus do this if these were his kids? How would he parent in this situation? If Jesus was about to walk in this meeting, what would his feelings be? What would his, I think there's some practical applications, and that's more often than not how we ask that question or maybe how we apply this thought. But the problem with that is that Jesus isn't always predictable. Sometimes he walked into places and he sat down and he had dinner with people. Other times he walked into places and he flipped the tables. Sometimes he walked into places and he was kind and loving and compassionate, even to religious people. Other times he called them out in front of people. Sometimes he found himself while aware of the situation and what was going on around him. Other times he slept through situations like a storm when his disciples thought they were going to die. Like sometimes Jesus was eager to meet a crowd. Other times it tells us he slipped away from the crowds and went to find something that was more quiet and solitude. Sometimes he would march right into conflict. Sometimes he would avoid conflict. And he would slip out to avoid certain conversations. And so it can't be just as simple, this idea of what would Jesus do. Obviously, it's not just as simple as just always doing what he did, because what he did changed from situation to situation. If you read the stories and you look at how Jesus interacted, he was present and he was led and he was obedient and he had discernment and he has wisdom. He didn't swing at everything the same way. And so even though there's some simple things that obviously, yes, some of us could apply this question to our lives. What would Jesus do? I think it actually gets a little more complex in some situations. There's not always the right way to do something. Sometimes there's multiple ways to do something. Have you ever been faced with that? Like you kind of come up to a situation or a conversation or a decision. You're like, I could do this or I could do this. And you could ask, what would Jesus do? But like, is Jesus really, do we have an application for whether he would go to this department in my new business or work for that department? Is there an application for that? Like which area he would work with? It would talk about parenting with kids. Like we could say, well, what would Jesus do? Well, he'd be kind, he'd be loving. But how would he confront that sin in their lives? Like we don't have a situation where Jesus was a dad personally and familiar to a kid. He wasn't married, didn't have kids. So there's some situations that maybe we might have to dig deeper than just the obvious, like what's the right and wrong? Because if we're honest, life gets a little bit messier than just simple yes or no, simple right or wrong. Sometimes it gets a little more complicated. So there's more to following Jesus than just being nice. I think some of us, though, could probably start there. Like, that would be a good start for some of us in the room. You know, some of us, there's got to be, I think this What Would Jesus Do movement is about more than contemplating what's the kind or moral thing to do. I think it's more about knowing Jesus intimately, knowing how he lived, knowing why he lived, knowing why he made the decisions he did, imitating his life, being led by his Spirit. And so I would say this, What Would Jesus Do is about moving beyond the hypotheticals of what he might do to learning and leaning into the realities of what he did do. And so this is what we're going to be doing over this next, 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks. We haven't decided how long we're going to do this, but this is what we're going to be looking at. We're going to move beyond the hypotheticals of what might Jesus do if he were in this situation to the realities. Like, is there things in his word that give us clarity on the character of who he is, why he did what he did, and maybe that might help us understand why or how we should do what we do in our lives. We want to focus on the Jesus detailed in the Bible, not the Jesus that's being portrayed by our culture. Like, we want to move outside of the phrase or the statement of the woke Jesus. Like, if Jesus were in our culture, we want to move beyond that and get detailed into, like, what did he actually do? How did he actually interact? Are there pieces of his character and the ways and whys he did things that we can learn for ourselves? And what would Jesus do? I believe it's an invitation. It's an invitation to have an intentional way of living. I believe with this idea of what would Jesus do, it's an invitation or commitment to a spiritual practice. It's an invitation to consider what Jesus did and have it help us make our decisions in our day. In fact, we have a name for that, a name for this process, a name for this way of thinking, and it's this. It's called discipleship. Or what Jesus gathered around him, it was a disciple. People who learned actually what Jesus would do in that situation. And these are devoted followers of Jesus. And oftentimes when we read the New Testament, we think about disciples as being these 12 guys or those 11 guys or those 3 guys. But technically speaking, you are a disciple of Jesus. You are a follower of Jesus. You're learning, you're watching, you're gleaning, you're taking from him. Another word for this is an apprentice. If you're in the business world, maybe you've had an apprenticeship, meaning someone that's committed to you for a season of time to learn a specific task. That's why we follow Jesus. That's what we're doing. We're followers of him for a specific amount of time, as long as we live on this earth. And we want to learn and draw and be as close to like him as we can while we're here. We have a limited amount of time. That's what apprenticeship is. You have a defined amount of time and you want to learn a task or you want to learn a job. And that's what we're doing. Jesus, we want to learn to live like you. But inside this idea of disciple, Jesus had layers of disciples. And I think this is true in the church today. Jesus had the 3 that were the closest to him, Peter, James, and John. They were the 3 that went in with him to the deepest part of the Garden of Gethsemane to pray with him. They were the 3 that were on the mountain with him during the transfiguration. They were the 3 that went with him into the house to see the dead girl brought back to life. These 3 had different experiences. Then there was the 12 that went with him everywhere, that were with him, that heard all his sermons, that spent time with him. They were on the boat when it was rocky and Jesus was sleeping. They were on the boat when they left Jesus on the shore and he came walking across the water. These 12 had interactions and they were disciples. But then the New Testament tells us that there were 72. That there's a group of 72 disciples that Jesus sent them out. And he says, I'm sending you out in the power of the Holy Spirit. And they preached and they healed people. They cast out demons and they came back and they were amazed. Like, man, God works through people like us. But then even beyond that, there's a group that we would call the crowd. A group of people, thousands of people at times, that would follow Jesus from town to town, village to village. They were also disciples, devoted followers trying to learn and glean something from him. And so I want to show you some different scriptures today, kind of an overview for this series. And I want to take a look at what it truly means to be a disciple, what it truly means to live a what would Jesus do kind of life. And so to do that, we're going to look at the story of the disciples. So Mark chapter 1, verse 16 through 20. This is the beginning of Jesus gathering his disciples. It says in 16, passing alongside the Sea of Galilee, Jesus saw Simon and Andrew, the brother Simon, casting out a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men. And immediately they left their nets and they followed him. And going a little further, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were in the boat mending their nets. And immediately Jesus called out to them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat. See you, Dad? There's a cooler guy over here. They left Zebedee with some hired servants, and they followed Jesus. See, this is what makes Jesus unique, and this is what makes our story and our interaction with Jesus unique too. Traditionally, in the Hebrew culture, rabbis would have disciples. This was not something new in the Hebrew culture, in the Jewish culture, for a rabbi to have disciples. Not new. Rabbis always had disciples. They always had a small group of underlings, guys of apprentices, or if you grew up in a Star Wars world, Padawans, that were underneath them learning the skills, learning the craft, learning the word, learning how to teach, learning how to handle problems and situations. All rabbis had disciples. But what made Jesus different, and this is a seemingly like simple story right here, but we don't gather the power of what Jesus is doing here if we don't know the context. Because in all Jewish rabbi-disciple relationships, it was like an application process. To be a disciple was like to get into an Ivy League school. There's only a few people got to do that. And you had to be the best of the best. You had to have the right lineage. You had to grow up the right way. You had to have the right parents. You had to have the right jobs. You had to make the right decisions to be able to get into these programs. Just the elite got into these programs. Now here's a rabbi. He's walking around a town from shore yelling out at fishermen who were crude, broken Galileans. In fact, when Peter preached his first sermon after the resurrection of Jesus, they knew Peter was a Galilean because of the accent. He was known as just a normal, regular guy. The Galileans were just working folk. You might even say they were like rednecks. Yeah, like they got a little bit of an accent, right? And this is how Jesus goes to find his disciples. There's no application process. There's no, let me check your family lineage, your family history. What have they done? How much have they given to the temple? No, Jesus goes out and finds a ragtag group of guys, and he invites them to follow him. He flips the script. And this is powerful because I think when we think about discipleship, oftentimes we think about what I need to do to serve God, when the invitation is really Jesus looking at you saying, come do life with me. We're always thinking about what do I need to do? What's the levels of expectation? How can I achieve this? How do I get into the club? How do I live a life a certain way so that I can be accepted or loved by Christ? Yet Christ flips the script and says, I'm going to take you how you are and I'm going to help you get where you need to be. And this is the beauty of discipleship when it comes to the body of Christ. Jesus flipped the script for us. What used to be a competition for the elite is now an invitation for the ordinary. And because of that, I'm preaching the word today. I'm just an ordinary guy. Because of that, you're loved and you have purpose and you have calling in God's family. And so what does it look like? What do we see when we look at the disciples? What does it look like to be a disciple? What does it look like to live a what would Jesus do kind of life? And here's the first calling of disciples, as I think is this. We see this in Mark. The first calling of a disciple is to be with Jesus. The very first thing is to be with Jesus. Mark chapter 3, we go a little bit further into Jesus recruiting disciples, kind of moving along in the story. It says he appointed the 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they may be with him. There was a choosing of Jesus to grab ordinary men, and before he sent them out to do anything, the first thing, it says that he chose that they might be with them. Then secondly, let's get the order right, that he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. But our first assignment as disciples is not to do work for the Lord, is to be with the Lord. And I think this is what maybe blows a lot of our personal theology up, because I think a lot of us approach God like, I'm not good enough, what can I do? God's not hearing my prayers unless I pray a certain way. God doesn't want to meet with me. I shouldn't even walk into church unless I read my Bible a few times. Like oftentimes we feel that way, that I can't be used, or God doesn't want to know me unless I do something. Yet the first invitation is not to do anything at all, but to just be with him. And so I would say this, the invitation for us as disciples, because all discipleship is an invitation from Jesus. The invitation is to be with. The invitation is to be intimate with Christ. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and what Jesus and the rabbis and the disciples would have been studying would have been written in Hebrew. And the title for God, so if they were talking about God, teaching about God, would have been Elohim or Yahweh, YHWH. Those would have been the written text that they would have read when referencing God. Yet when Jesus teaches the disciples to pray to God, this is what Jesus says. This is our approach. It says, pray then like this, our Father, and this was all written, the New Testament's written in Greek, but this one word, this is crazy when you study the Greek of the prayer that was written, the whole prayer is written in Greek, but one word was left in Aramaic, which would have been the spoken tongue of Jesus. So this is the recorded conversation of Jesus, all written in Greek so other people can read it, so it can go to the nations in the world, but they left one word Aramaic, and that's this word, Abba. So it says, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. This Abba is an Aramaic term meaning father. And the author, like I said, wrote the original text in Greek, but that remained in Aramaic. The Aramaic term sneaks through and remains in the Gospels untranslated in the Greek, likely because God had never been referred to as Father. So for them to quote Jesus, they had to only quote him because no one has ever approached God in that manner. So they can't just write the word that's always been in Scripture because all of a sudden they had a paradigm shift. The disciples, as they heard Jesus talking about this, their world was flipped upside down. I'm not casting up prayers in a certain way, hoping they're good enough for him to hear. No, my prayers are heard because I have a heavenly Father who loves me. And so this sneaks in Aramaic, and it gives us some context to what the disciples, they knew this was different. When we write this in Greek to share with other people, we're leaving that word. That was intentional. It's not just God, but it was our Father. There's a difference in calling someone by their title versus calling someone by their name. There's a difference with saying, God, that's who you are, that's where you sit on the heavens. There's a difference in approaching him saying, our Father. There's a difference. I don't know if you've got a personal doctor, a primary care doctor, and when you see him, you may say, hey, Dr. Stephen. I've got a friend, Dr. Stephen. As you may say, Dr. Stephen, but after I've had breakfast with a few times, I don't say doc anymore. I say Stephen, right? And like, same thing with me. Like, you may say pastor a few times, but some of you I've hung out with some, and you start saying John. I even had someone, like, apologize. Like, I'm sorry, I should call you pastor. It's like, no, I'm just John. We're just having a burger. Like, it's good. You know, but once you get to know someone, you move beyond the titles. Like your kids, they call you mother, father. No, most of them don't. Most of them probably call you mommy or daddy. It's a term of affection. It's not a title, but it's almost a name that defines who you are. The priest called him Elohim and Yahweh, but the disciples called him Father, Abba. Acts 4:13 says this. Now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, the church is forming. Peter just preached his first sermon. It says they perceived that they were uneducated. Remember, they're from Galilee. Uneducated men, common men. They were astonished, and this is what they were astonished of, not their amazing sermons, but they were astonished and they recognized that they had been with Jesus. The markings for the astonishment were not the miracles. That hadn't happened yet. They just preached the word, and what they sensed when Peter was preaching the word was that Peter was someone who knew Jesus. He sounded like Jesus. It sounded like he had been with Jesus. Has anyone ever said something like that about you? I would think this would be maybe the greatest compliment to ever get as a follower of Christ. Like, I was hanging out with John the other day, and like he was sharing some advice or was asking him some questions, but all of a sudden there were some things that started coming out. It sounded like Jesus. Man, that's such a powerful thought that they had pushed themselves away and they had followed and been with him so much that they started to sound like the person they followed. The words that were coming out of their mouth were not just repetitive words, but they actually came from their heart, actually felt like it was coming from Jesus. John chapter 15, verse 5 says, I am the vine. This is the invitation from Jesus, and you are the branches. If you remain in me, this is with me, and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. The second calling of a disciple we see in this is to be like Jesus. First is to be with Jesus. Second is to be like Jesus, to become like Jesus. 1 Peter 2:21 says this, "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you. He left an example so that you might follow in his footsteps." Follow in his footsteps. You see, I think the "what would Jesus do" movement is skips step one and goes right to this step. That's the question kind of drives us to this. Like, what would Jesus do? What did he do that I can also do? How can I follow him? How can I learn more about him? But let's not forget that first step, to be with him. But then the next step does call us to follow him, to be like him. The invitation for us is to be like, and I would say this is to imitate. The invitation for us is to imitate. I combined those two words. That's kind of cool. Invitation. Imitate. You know, if I got to be honest, thinking about Father, we just talked about that's our access. We have that access to God, to be with him. There's personal, tangible, like God wants to know us. And then I start to think about this, the imitation. I think about the Father. If I'm being really honest, one of the scariest parts of being a dad is the fact that your kids start to act like you. That is one of the scariest things in the world, when you see your kids start to be like dad. It's cute when they're 2 and 3. It's scary when they're 13, 14, 15, 16. You start to realize I'm shaping an adult. I'm casting them out. Where did they learn this? They haven't been that many places besides here in school. And so, you know, that's a whole other conversation on their sermon. But the here part, the my part, like I start wondering, like, did they hear that from me? Did they learn that from me? And as they're growing up, it starts to look more and more like a mirror and less like a son or a daughter. Except this is not one of those mirrors like they're at the mall that when you look at it, it makes you feel better about yourself. It's like the opposite, right? Have you ever been to the carnival or to a fair and it's the fat mirror? That's what it's like when you start raising kids. You start looking at the mirror and you go, oh, dear God, that's what I sound like. That's what I look like. That's what that feels like for someone to say that or act like that. You start to realize they're imitating you and following you. And our kids are always watching us. They're always learning from us. They're always picking up things from us. And just the other day, I was at a restaurant with my youngest son. He's 4, Abel. He's super cute. And I ordered a glass of tea, in which my 4-year-old son, Abel, goes, the waitress came around to him. And my kids know this because we're frugal, and so they look at me to find out if they can get water or something else. So they all look at Dad until I nod. And if I nod, they know they can get a Coke or whatever. So he's looking at me, and I say tea, and he's like, I look at him, I nod at him. He's like, I'll take a tea. I was like, no, you're 4. You don't need any caffeine, dude. Lemonade or Sprite. And he's like, lemonade, okay. And so the waitress brings out my cup. And, of course, my cup is a glass with no lid. And she says, would you like a straw? I said, no, I don't need a straw. I'm a man. It doesn't, you don't feel manly drinking out of a straw. Let's be honest. Like, I drink from the glass. I don't care where your hands have been on it. I'm a man. I can take it. This is a tip for those of you dating right now. One of my youth pastor growing up, talking about the 90s, he said, hey, if you're ever on a date, one of the worst things you can do as a dude is get a straw, because you're trying to make eye contact, and in your mouth you start searching for it. Your tongue is out. It's like, just take the straw out and pick the glass up. Be a man. But so that's what I do. I don't drink from straws, not very often. And so I got my glass. Of course, Abel, I look over, and the first thing, what's he doing? He's taking his lid off, taking a straw out, and he's like, I'm going to drink it like Dad. And I'm like, okay, Mom's not over here. It's good. Let's go. And, of course, you know what happens. A few minutes later, the lemonade is everywhere. His pants are soaked. My pants are soaked. The table's soaked. My French fries are in soup now. It's not good. But in that moment, like, I kind of laughed about it. Wasn't no big deal. I'll get more French fries. I know the waitresses will bring us more food. I know his pants. It doesn't matter if he looks like he peed in them. He's 4. No one cares. I know it's no big deal. And so he's kind of looking at me a little bit intimidated, a little bit scared, like wondering what's Dad going to do, because he knows he messed up and he knows that he should have had a lid, but I let him. And I was like, hey, it's no big deal, Abel. Let's put a lid on it this time. He's like, okay, Dad. You know, but I was thinking about that, like how quickly, just a 4-year-old, he wanted to do exactly like Dad did. No lid, give me the tea, give me a glass, no straw. I'm going to drink it like a man. You know, and our kids do that. Our kids are emulating us. They're watching us. And if your kids aren't watching you, they're watching someone else. And that's a scary thought for us. Like, who are your kids with? I tell you, one of the best decisions you can make as a parent is choose your kids' friends. Be involved in it. I'm serious. Get involved in it. If you don't like someone, get them away from them. Help them have good friends, because whoever they're around, whatever they're hearing, they will start to imitate those things. If you have the opportunity to have your kids in Christian education, or you have the opportunity to homeschool or something like that, I think it's not a bad idea to be able to control the voices, because kids imitate things. They learn things. And as followers of Christ, we're kids. And Jesus is the example. Jesus is our leader. And just like my son was eager to watch and look for the affirmation and the permission to live and to walk, I think we should be doing that the same way with Jesus. We should be looking to Jesus and going, hey, which way? Can I go this way? Can I do this thing? Like, Jesus, hey, is this okay? Did I do this good, Dad? Are you proud of me? Is this okay? I think we should have that approach when it comes to Jesus. We should have that approach when it comes to him, to imitate. Third calling of a disciple is to do what Jesus did. To do what Jesus did. And this one gets simple, because we can look at Jesus and we can look at situations and scenarios and go, okay, there's some wisdom in that. I'm going to do that. Let's look at John chapter 13 through 17. You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. So there's the position. That's who he is. And here are we. We're students. We're disciples. We're followers. We're apprentice. We're Padawans. We're looking to Jesus. This is who you call me, and you're right. That's what I am. And he says this, if you know that if there's an if I, then there's always a then you. And so if I do this, if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash the feet of one another. And he goes on to say this, for I have given you an example, not just so you can watch, listen, and learn, but an example that you should also, what's this word right here? Say this with me, that you should also, one more time, that you should also do, just as I have done to you. Truly I say to you, a servant is no greater than his master, nor is his messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. Eugene Patterson says the thing, it's a great quote that kind of captures this thought. To follow Jesus means that we can't separate what Jesus is saying from what Jesus is doing. And that the way that he is doing it, to follow Jesus is as much or maybe even more about feet as it is about ears and eyes. To follow Jesus isn't just about what you hear. It's not just about what you learn. It's not just about what you believe. It's not just about what you think or what you feel. To follow Jesus, to be a disciple of Jesus, to be someone who asks, what would Jesus do? We're not just seeking information or affirmation. What we're seeking is a way of life that we can practice, we can know, and we can do. We've got to be people who don't just believe a certain thing, but we do a certain thing. Like the apostles, when they preached, it says, Peter looks like someone who's been with him. Why did they say that? Why did they know that he had been with Jesus? Because of what he was doing, what he was saying. It didn't just affect his beliefs. It wasn't just his own thing. In fact, I would say to be a disciple or a follower of Jesus, if it's just your own thing, you might not be doing it right. People should be experiencing it around you. It should be out loud. It should affect you. You should be part of how you do things, part of how you say things, part of how you handle your business, part of how you handle your marriage, part of how you handle your friendships. To have a real relationship with Jesus, it has to impact your real life. It's not just something that I do on Sundays or something I do in my quiet time. It has to affect us in a way that it changes our doing, not just our being. We want to be with him. We've got to be close to him. We want to be like him. But ultimately, we've got to start to do what he did. An invitation here is to do. It's to obey. The invitation is to do. It's to obey. What's the point of what would Jesus do? It's not just to know, it's to do what Jesus did. Apprenticeship, if you've been in business or leadership, you might have seen this before, but here's a simple way of looking at apprenticeship, or a simple way of looking at discipleship is this. It's how it starts. I do, you watch. Jesus does, I'm watching, I'm reading, I'm learning. Jesus does, we do. Now I'm doing it with him. Like, God, I need your help. I'm not sure, I've never done this before, I've never shared my faith before, I've never served before, I've never given before, whatever it may be. And then all of a sudden, what it starts to do is you do it, and he's helping you. You're stepping out in faith to live the life he's called you to live. And then last, you do, and he watches. He cheers you on. Hebrews says there's a great cloud of witnesses cheering us on so that we would finish the race. Like the heaven is watching. They're watching us, and they're cheering us on, saying, you do what he did. You live the life he's called you to live. And when we look at the early church, they didn't just do what Jesus did, they also did what he told them to do. You see, that's where when it gets to a sticky place, when you're like, I'm not sure if I can do this. I'm not sure if this what would Jesus do is applicable. Like last time I read that Jesus went to church, he ripped a veil in half and knocked some tables over, and like I want to eat Dunkaroos, not throw them on the ground. So what's the application here? So maybe it's not what did Jesus do. It may also be what is he telling you to do. And it's not just emulating what you've seen. It's also listening and doing what you've been told. And Jesus gives us direction for our life and character for our life and wisdom for our life. And ultimately, this is what's, to me, is such a powerful thought and convicting thought is this. Is that when we're with Jesus, when we're like Jesus, when we're doing things how Jesus did them, where we go, Jesus goes. Where we go, Jesus goes. Jesus lives in us. He works through us. What would Jesus do? It has to move beyond a catchphrase or even a challenging question meant to inspire our decisions. We've got to embody this because to many people, the Jesus they will come to know is the one they see in you. To many people, the Jesus that they're going to learn to trust, they're first going to see him in you first. They're going to experience him in you first. And this is a sobering thought. Really, Jesus, me. You've got something like you want to be with me, but not just with me. You want to work through me, and not just through me and for me, but through me for other people. In fact, I would say some people are even praying right now, and the prayer requests that they're lifting up to God, the answer is found in you. They may be praying for a friend, and you might be it. They may be praying, God, I need provision, and you may be the generous person in their life. They may be praying, I need someone to help me partner with my kids, and you may be jumping into serving kids or serving youth. The prayers, often people are praying, the answers are found in the body of Christ, Jesus working through us. In fact, we just had Egg the Park and loved on lots of people and shared egg hunts with people, and I was talking to a guy Easter Sunday. He walked here from the Linwood Park area. He was at the Linwood Park, he saw our egg hunts, and he walked here on Easter Sunday. That's not a short walk. That's like 7 or 8 miles as the crow flies. I don't know how long it is if you take the streets. And I was talking to him after service and asking, like, what made you come here? Like, that's a long walk, man. There's got to be some churches close to you. And this is what he said. No one has ever been as nice to me as what those people in the yellow shirts were that Saturday morning. No one's ever been that nice to me. I always get judged. People look at me. They make assumptions about me. But I had multiple people ask me my name. No one preached a message that day. No one got on the megaphone and grabbed a Bible and started thumping it. All we did was love people with the love of Christ. I'm telling you that the Jesus that lives in you is what's going to impact the world around us. We're praying for God to move in our city, and what you may be not understanding, what you maybe fully grasping is that when we pray that prayer, what you're really doing is you're asking for Jesus to work through you in a greater capacity. When we say, Jesus, would you save my friend? We got a cross over there with hundreds of names of people that we're believing would come to know Jesus. Our friends, our family. And when many of you put that name on the cross, what you maybe didn't recognize is that you are giving Jesus an invitation to work through you, to minister to them, to bring him to them. Like Jesus, where we go, Jesus goes. The invitation of discipleship and apprenticeship is an invitation for not just Jesus to be with you, but for Jesus to work through you. And this is the implications of what would Jesus do. It's not just, I make better decisions. Not, I just choose this over that. Not, I just get discernment and wisdom. Like, what would Jesus do? The implications are greater than that. Because I believe when we live a what would Jesus do kind of life, it doesn't just affect us. It starts affecting all those around us.